Your DNA holds secrets you never expected, traces of ancient warriors, lost migrations, and genetic mysteries hidden for thousands of years. Scandinavians are often associated with the fierce Viking warriors who once roamed the seas, but the truth is far more complex. Modern Scandinavian DNA is surprisingly different from what many imagine. In fact, recent research shows that the genetic makeup of today's Scandinavians is not the same as their Viking ancestors. But why? What happened over the centuries that reshaped their DNA? And what makes Scandinavian genetics stand out from the rest of Europe? Thousands of years ago, the lands that are now Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were home to isolated groups of hunter-gatherers, braving the cold, harsh landscapes. These were some of the first people to settle in Scandinavia, living off the land long before farming was even introduced. But then, about 6,000 years ago, a major shift occurred. Farmers from Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey, arrived, bringing agriculture and new technologies. These early farmers mixed with the native hunter-gatherers, creating the foundation of what we now recognize as Scandinavian ancestry. But the most dramatic change came during the Bronze Age, around 4,500 years ago, when nomadic steppe warriors migrated into the region. These new arrivals brought with them Indo-European languages, advanced metalworking, and an entirely new genetic layer. Fast forward to the Viking Age, and Scandinavia was experiencing another genetic transformation. The Viking era wasn't just about raiding and conquering. It was a time of intense migration and mixing of different populations. Scandinavian warriors traveled as far as the British Isles, France, Russia, and even the Middle East, spreading their genes across vast territories. But at the same time, people from these regions were also arriving in Scandinavia. British-Irish ancestry became surprisingly common in Viking Age Scandinavia due to centuries of interactions, both friendly and hostile. In places like Sweden, Eastern Baltic and Slavic ancestry increased, especially in key trading hubs like Gotland and central Sweden. There were even traces of Mediterranean DNA, brought by long-distance traders and mercenaries who settled in Scandinavian lands. But here's the mystery. If Viking-era Scandinavians had so much British-Irish and Baltic ancestry, why do modern Scandinavians show less of it today? Something changed after the Viking Age. Some genetic influences faded over time, likely due to later migrations, population shifts, and social structures that favored certain bloodlines over others. In some regions, ancient Viking-era immigrants may have left fewer descendants than expected, leading to their DNA being gradually diluted. This means that while Viking ancestry is still present, it's not as dominant as some might assume. Another surprising discovery in Scandinavian DNA is the genetic divide between the North and South. If you compare the DNA of someone from southern Sweden to someone from northern Norway, you'll find clear differences. Southern Scandinavians share more genetic similarities with other Western Europeans, while northern Scandinavians have higher levels of Uralic ancestry, genes that connect them to the indigenous Sami people and even distant Siberian populations. This north-south genetic divide has existed since at least the Viking Age, and possibly much earlier. If you've ever taken a DNA test and found unexpected Scandinavian ancestry, there's a reason for that. Many people in Britain, Germany, and even parts of France and Italy may have some Scandinavian DNA due to Viking migrations. But here's where it gets tricky. Just because you have Scandinavian DNA doesn't necessarily mean you descend from Vikings. Some of the so-called Scandinavian DNA actually comes from much older shared ancestors, long before the Viking Age. To make things even more complicated, different DNA testing companies define Scandinavian ancestry in different ways, meaning your results can vary depending on which company you test with. Scandinavian DNA isn't just about Vikings. It's the result of thousands of years of migrations, lost lineages, and surprising genetic shifts. Unlike many European populations, Scandinavians have a unique genetic signature shaped by geography, history, and movement across continents. So, if you've ever wondered what makes Scandinavian DNA so special, the answer lies deep in the past, in the footsteps of the people who walked these lands long before the first Vikings set sail. Gotland, an island in the Baltic Sea, holds a secret hidden deep in its DNA, a story of migration, conquest, and unexpected genetic blending. If you were to trace the ancestry of a Viking from Gotland and compare it to a Viking from Norway, you'd notice something surprising. Their genetic makeup is not the same. In fact, throughout Scandinavia, different regions show unique ancestry patterns, revealing a history far more complex than the common image of a single Viking people. But why? What caused these genetic differences? The answer lies in centuries of migrations that shaped each part of Scandinavia differently. Let's start with eastern Sweden and Gotland. During the Viking Age, these areas were major trading centers, connecting Scandinavia with the rest of Europe, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. Unlike Western Vikings, who were known for their raids in England, Ireland, and France, Eastern Vikings, often called Varangians, traveled deep into the lands of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. This intense trade and interaction with the Slavic world led to an increased influx of Eastern Baltic and even distant Asian ancestry into central Sweden and Gotland. Genetic analysis shows that people from this region during the Viking Age had a stronger connection to Eastern Europeans compared to their Western Scandinavian counterparts. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Modern Swedes show much less Eastern Baltic DNA than their Viking Age ancestors. Somewhere between then and now, this genetic influence declined. In contrast, Norway tells a different genetic story. Norwegian Vikings were seafarers, pushing westward to the British Isles, Iceland, and even North America. This resulted in a heavy genetic exchange between Norway and places like Scotland and Ireland. Even today, Norwegians carry a noticeable amount of British-Irish ancestry, a lasting imprint of Viking raids, settlements, and intermarriages. However, compared to Sweden, Norway saw less gene flow from the east, making its genetic makeup distinctly different from eastern Scandinavia. Denmark, located at the gateway between Scandinavia and mainland Europe, was a melting pot of different influences. While Danish Vikings also raided and settled in England, their proximity to Germany and the Netherlands led to strong genetic connections with Central Europeans. This is why modern Danes show more genetic similarity to Northern Germans and Dutch populations compared to Norwegians and Swedes. However, during the Viking Age, Denmark was also influenced by Southern European gene flow, possibly due to trading connections that extended deep into the Mediterranean. The most striking genetic contrast within Scandinavia, however, is the North-South divide. Northern Scandinavia, particularly in Norway and Sweden, has significantly higher levels of Uralic ancestry. This genetic component comes from ancient migrations of the Sami and other indigenous groups who lived in the region long before the arrival of Germanic-speaking people. This northern genetic signature is also linked to distant Siberian populations, making it one of the most unique features of Scandinavian DNA. The further south you go, the less of this Uralic influence you'll find, as southern Scandinavia was shaped more by European and steppe migrations. Even within regions, different social classes may have had distinct genetic profiles. Viking rulers and traders, who traveled widely and interacted with many cultures, likely had more diverse ancestry than rural farmers who stayed in one place for generations. This could explain why DNA from ancient urban centers shows more genetic mixing than rural areas. Scandinavian DNA is far from uniform. The genetic map of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark tells a story of regional variation, shaped by different migration patterns, trade routes, and historical events. Whether it's the Eastern Baltic influences in central Sweden, the strong British-Irish connections in Norway, or the Central European ties of Denmark, every part of Scandinavia has its own unique ancestry. So, if you have Scandinavian heritage, your DNA might carry hidden clues about which part of this complex history your ancestors belong to. Scandinavian DNA holds a secret that stretches back thousands of years, a genetic fingerprint shaped by some of the most dramatic migrations in human history. But where did the first Scandinavians come from? If we go back far enough, we find a time when the lands of modern Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were completely covered in ice. No humans lived there. So how did the ancestors of the Vikings and modern Scandinavians come to settle this harsh northern landscape? The answer lies in a series of migrations that transformed the region over millennia. The first settlers arrived after the Ice Age, around 10,000 years ago. These early Scandinavians were hunter-gatherers, genetically similar to the Mesolithic populations of Western and Eastern Europe. But they weren't all the same. Two distinct groups entered Scandinavia from different directions. One group, known as the Western hunter-gatherers, came from the south through present-day Denmark. The other, called the Eastern hunter-gatherers, migrated from the northeast, crossing into what is now Sweden. Their genetic footprints can still be seen in modern Scandinavians, especially in the far north. Then, around 6,000 years ago, a new wave of people arrived, the first farmers. They were part of the Neolithic migration that spread agriculture across Europe from the Middle East. Unlike the hunter-gatherers before them, these farmers had a very different genetic makeup, with strong ties to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They brought livestock, crops, and entirely new ways of life. However, in Scandinavia, they didn't completely replace the hunter-gatherers. Instead, the two groups mixed over time, creating a unique genetic blend that would shape the future population. But the biggest transformation came with the arrival of a third major group, the Amnea. Around 4,500 years ago, these steppe nomads from the Pontic-Caspian region, modern Ukraine and southern Russia, moved into Scandinavia as part of a massive migration that reshaped all of Europe. These people brought with them new technologies, the Proto-Germanic language, and a dominant genetic influence that still makes up a large portion of Scandinavian DNA today. In fact, Scandinavian populations have some of the highest levels of steppe ancestry in all of Europe. This migration also introduced new social structures and warrior cultures, setting the stage for what would eventually become the Viking Age. By the time we reached the Bronze Age and Iron Age, Scandinavia had developed into a distinct genetic and cultural region. The mixture of these three ancestral groups, hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and steppe nomads, created a genetic profile that was unlike anywhere else in Europe. This combination led to physical traits that are often associated with Scandinavians today, such as lighter skin, blue or green eyes, and tall stature. But even within Scandinavia, different regions retain different levels of these ancestral components, which explains some of the variation seen today. Scandinavia's genetic past is a story of resilience, adaptation, and migration. From the first Ice Age hunters to the arrival of farmers and the massive impact of the steppe migrations, each wave of newcomers left a lasting mark. These migrations didn't just shape the DNA of Scandinavians, they influenced their languages, cultures, and even their expansion during the Viking Age. Understanding this ancient genetic history helps explain why Scandinavian DNA is so unique. The Viking Age is often seen as the defining era of Scandinavian history, but the genetic changes that happened during this time were just as groundbreaking as their legendary raids. While the Vikings left a cultural and political impact across Europe, they also reshaped the very DNA of Scandinavia itself. But where exactly did this genetic influx come from? And how did it change the genetic landscape of the region forever? During the Viking Age, 750 to 1050 CE, Scandinavia experienced an unprecedented movement of people. Unlike earlier migrations, this wasn't just a case of outsiders arriving. It was a two-way exchange. Scandinavians set sail for distant lands, but many people also traveled to Scandinavia, bringing new genetic influences. DNA evidence from Viking-era burials reveals three major sources of gene flow into Scandinavia: the British-Irish Isles, the Eastern Baltic, and Southern Europe. The British-Irish influence was particularly significant. Many of the Vikings who settled in Ireland, Scotland, and England didn't just leave their mark on those lands. They also brought back people with them. Some were traders, others were allies, and some were captives taken during raids. Over time, these individuals integrated into Scandinavian society, leaving a lasting genetic impact. In fact, ancient DNA shows that British-Irish ancestry became widespread in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. This influence is especially visible in Denmark and southern Sweden, where the highest levels of British-Irish DNA are still present in modern populations. But Scandinavia wasn't only looking westward. Another major wave of gene flow came from the east, particularly from the regions around the eastern Baltic and modern-day Russia. This is most evident in central Sweden and Gotland, where Viking trade networks were deeply connected to the Slavic and Finnic peoples of Eastern Europe. Many of these individuals arrived as merchants, warriors, or even as part of diplomatic marriages. Genetic studies confirm that the Viking Age saw an increase in Eastern Baltic ancestry in these regions, though this influence appears to have faded in modern times. A third, lesser-known source of Viking Age gene flow came from southern Europe. Scandinavian warriors and mercenaries served in elite military units, such as the Byzantine Varangian Guard, and some of them returned home with foreign wives or children of mixed heritage. This explains why some Viking burials contain individuals with genetic signatures linking them to southern European populations like the Greeks, Italians, and even the Middle East. However, this influence was not as widespread as the British Irish or Eastern Baltic gene flow. Despite these waves of new ancestry, the Viking Age did not completely transform Scandinavian DNA. Instead, it added layers to an already complex genetic history. The core genetic structure, descended from the region's ancient hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and steppe nomads, remained intact. The new gene flow simply mixed with these earlier ancestries, creating subtle regional variations that are still detectable in Scandinavians today. One fascinating discovery is that while external gene flow into Scandinavia was significant, it appears that many of the immigrants who arrived during the Viking Age did not leave as strong a genetic mark as expected. In some regions, their ancestry is far less prominent in modern Scandinavians than it was in Viking-era remains. This suggests that some groups may have assimilated culturally without necessarily having long-term genetic continuity. The genetic legacy of the Viking Age is not just about conquest, it's about movement, connection, and exchange. Scandinavians of this era were not isolated warriors. They were part of a vast, interconnected world where trade, alliances, and even captives played a role in shaping the genetic identity of the region. The Viking Age may be over, but its impact is still visible in the DNA of modern Scandinavians. Scandinavian DNA is unique not just because of Viking ancestry, but because it carries the traces of an extraordinary evolutionary journey shaped by isolation, migration, and adaptation to one of the most challenging environments in Europe. The genetics of modern Scandinavians reveal deep connections to some of the oldest populations in Europe, but they also show surprising influences from groups that few would expect. One of the most striking features of Scandinavian DNA is the north-south genetic line, a gradual shift in ancestry that stretches from Denmark up to the Arctic regions of Norway and Sweden. This climb is primarily driven by the presence of Uralic ancestry, which is most pronounced in the far north. This genetic signature is linked to the Sami people, who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, long before the arrival of Germanic-speaking Scandinavians. Their ancestors were part of an ancient migration that brought Siberian-related DNA into northern Europe, and traces of this ancestry can still be found in modern Swedes and Norwegians, particularly in the north. Interestingly, Uralic ancestry didn't just appear in Scandinavia overnight. It seems to have arrived gradually over thousands of years, with waves of gene flow occurring at different times. Some of the earliest evidence of this ancestry in Scandinavia dates back to at least the Viking Age, and possibly earlier. Even some Viking warriors carried Uralic-associated Y chromosome markers, showing that this genetic influence was present in the Norse world. But the Sami weren't the only ancient group to leave a genetic imprint on Scandinavians. Modern Scandinavian DNA is an intricate mix of three major ancestral sources: Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and Bronze Age Indo-European migrants from the Pontic steppe. Each of these groups contributed something unique. The hunter-gatherers provided genetic adaptations for colder climates, such as lighter skin, to maximize vitamin D absorption in low sunlight conditions. The Neolithic farmers brought agricultural knowledge and new social structures. The Indo-European migrants, who arrived during the Bronze Age, introduced metalworking, herding skills, and many of the languages that would later evolve into modern Scandinavian tongues. One fascinating discovery is that Scandinavian hunter-gatherer ancestry persisted much longer in the region compared to other parts of Europe. Even after the arrival of Neolithic farmers, some groups in Scandinavia continued to rely on hunting and gathering for thousands of years. This genetic continuity explains why Scandinavians today retain a relatively high proportion of this ancient ancestry compared to other Europeans. Modern Scandinavians also show distinct genetic traits linked to their environment. The extreme winters and long, dark months of the North, selected for genetic adaptations related to metabolism and mental health. Some studies suggest that certain Scandinavian populations have unique variations in genes associated with mood regulation, potentially as an evolutionary response to the high prevalence of seasonal affective disorder. Another surprising aspect of Scandinavian DNA is how genetic diversity changed over time. The Viking Age brought a surge of external gene flow, but in some cases, these influences faded over the centuries. Some regions of Scandinavia show a genetic shift away from certain Viking-era ancestries, suggesting that not all immigrant groups left a lasting genetic legacy. Despite centuries of migration, conquest, and trade, Scandinavians have retained a unique genetic identity that sets them apart from other European populations. The deep-rooted ancestry of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, combined with later migrations from Neolithic farmers, Indo-European steppe herders, Uralic-speaking peoples, and Viking-era travelers, has created a fascinating genetic mosaic that continues to shape the people of the North today. Scandinavian DNA holds secrets that stretch across thousands of years, shaped by waves of migration, extreme environments, and even the genetic echoes of the legendary Viking Age. But how does this ancestry connect to modern Scandinavians, and what sets their DNA apart from the rest of Europe? One of the most defining aspects of Scandinavian DNA is its deep hunter-gatherer ancestry. Long before the arrival of agriculture, Northern Europe was home to resilient hunter-gatherer groups who adapted to harsh conditions. Their genetic legacy remains surprisingly strong in Scandinavians today, more so than in many other European populations. Traits such as lighter skin, an adaptation to low sunlight, and genetic markers associated with cold tolerance can be traced back to these early inhabitants. However, Scandinavia was far from isolated. The Neolithic Revolution brought farming communities from Anatolia, who mixed with local hunter-gatherers. While they introduced agriculture and settled life, their genetic impact was less dominant compared to other parts of Europe. This explains why modern Scandinavians still carry a significant proportion of pre-agricultural ancestry. Then came the Bronze Age migration, a defining moment in Scandinavian genetic history. Indo-European steppe herders moved into the region, bringing with them metalworking skills, new languages, and significant genetic influence. These newcomers introduced traits linked to height and certain metabolic adaptations that persist in Scandinavians today. They also played a crucial role in shaping the early Norse culture, laying the foundation for what would later become the Viking civilization. By the time of the Viking Age, Scandinavia had become a genetic crossroads. The seafaring Norse spread their DNA across Europe, leaving their genetic imprint in places as far as Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and even parts of Russia. At the same time, external gene flow entered Scandinavia. British-Irish ancestry became particularly common, as seen in ancient Viking graves. Baltic and Slavic influences also left their mark, especially in regions like Gotland and central Sweden. Yet, despite these migrations, modern Scandinavian DNA is still distinct. Over time, some of the external influences from the Viking Age faded, leading to a genetic profile that remains uniquely Scandinavian. The north-south genetic line, driven largely by Uralic ancestry in the north and steppe-related influences in the south, has persisted for centuries. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of Scandinavian genetics is the persistence of Uralic ancestry. Found at higher levels in northern Norway and Sweden, this genetic signal links modern Scandinavians to the indigenous Sami people, who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. This ancestry contributes to differences in metabolism, immune system function, and even adaptations to extreme cold. Despite centuries of change, Scandinavian DNA tells a story of resilience, adaptation, and deep ancestral roots. It reflects not just the well-known legacy of the Vikings, but an even older history, one that connects modern Scandinavians to some of the earliest people to inhabit northern Europe.